Ever wondered what happens when everyone bets against you, but your heart refuses to give up? This is the story that will remind you why champions aren't made in gyms. They're made from something deep inside them. Drop A if you've ever felt like the underdog, and let's dive into this incredible journey together. The crowd bet against him, but when Rocky Balboa stepped into the ring, he carried something his opponent had never faced before: the weight of a broken dream that refused to die. Philadelphia's underground boxing scene thrived on spectacle, and tonight's main event promised to be nothing short of a massacre. The betting odds were laughably one-sided. 50-1 against the Italian stallion, a washed-up club fighter whose best days seemed buried beneath layers of scar tissue and unfulfilled potential. Tommy, the Hammer, Morrison stood in his corner like a gladiator carved from marble, his perfectly sculpted physique glistening under the arena lights. At 28, he was everything modern boxing demanded: fast, brutal, and utterly without mercy. His record spoke volumes: 37 wins, 0 losses, 34 knockouts. The sports media had already crowned him the next heavyweight sensation, and tonight was supposed to be just another stepping stone toward inevitable greatness. Morrison's entourage surrounded him like disciples worshipping at the altar of violence, their designer suits and gold chains catching the light as they whispered strategies that sounded more like execution plans. The Hammer's confidence wasn't just visible, it was infectious. He shadowboxed with the fluid grace of a predator, each movement calculated to intimidate. His promoter, a slick-talking man named Vincent Marcelli, worked the crowd like a carnival barker, reminding everyone that this fight would be over before the third round. The arena's VIP section buzzed with celebrities and high rollers who had come to witness what they believed would be a public execution disguised as sport. Even the referee seemed apologetic as he approached Rocky's corner, as if he were about to oversee something that belonged more in a slaughterhouse than a boxing ring. But Rocky Balboa was different that night. Something had changed in the weeks leading up to this fight. His trainer, Mickey Goldmill, had noticed it first, a quiet intensity that replaced the usual nervousness. Where other fighters might have crumbled under the pressure of such overwhelming odds, Rocky seemed to draw strength from the doubts surrounding him. He sat on his stool in the corner, not shadowboxing or flexing for the cameras, but simply breathing. His eyes held a focus that hadn't been there in his previous fights, a clarity that suggested he understood something about this moment that no one else could grasp. The tale of how Rocky had reached this point read like a cautionary story about dreams deferred. Born and raised in the tough neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, he had grown up watching neighborhood kids channel their frustrations into their fists. Boxing had offered him an escape from a life that seemed destined for mediocrity, but after years of fighting in small clubs and taking beatings for modest purses, most people assumed his time had passed. At 31, he was considered ancient by boxing standards, a has-been who had never quite achieved his potential. Yet here he was, having somehow earned a shot at the fighter everyone considered unstoppable. The opportunity had come through a combination of circumstance and stubbornness. Morrison's original opponent had suffered an injury, and Rocky's manager had successfully argued that the Italian stallion deserved a chance to prove himself against elite competition. What the manager hadn't mentioned was that Rocky had been training harder than ever, driven by a desperation that only comes to men who realize they're staring at their last chance. The contrast between the two fighters couldn't have been more stark. Morrison entered the ring to thunderous applause, his red silk robe emblazoned with gold threading that spelled out "The Hammer" across his broad shoulders. He raised his gloved fists above his head, soaking in the adoration of a crowd that had already decided he was their champion. His smile was perfect, practiced, the kind of expression that graced magazine covers and endorsement deals. Everything about him screamed success, from his professional haircut to the way he moved with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything. Rocky's entrance was different, quieter, more humble. He wore simple black trunks and a plain grey robe that had seen better days. There was no elaborate music, no pyrotechnics, just the steady rhythm of his breathing and the soft shuffle of his feet against the canvas. The crowd's reaction was polite, but unenthusiastic, the kind of respectful acknowledgement reserved for someone about to be sacrificed for entertainment. He didn't play to the audience or attempt to generate excitement. Instead, he seemed to be having a private conversation with himself, preparing for something that went far beyond winning or losing. When the fighters met in the center of the ring for final instructions, the size difference was immediately apparent. Morrison towered over Rocky by at least 4 inches, his reach advantage obvious as the referee reviewed the rules. The Hammer stared down at his opponent with undisguised contempt, his jaw working a piece of gum as if he were already bored by what was about to unfold. He had studied film of Rocky's previous fights and saw nothing that concerned him, a plodding, predictable fighter who relied more on heart than technique. But Rocky's eyes told a different story. As he looked up at Morrison during the referee's instructions, there was no fear, no intimidation, just a quiet acknowledgement of what lay ahead. He had spent weeks visualizing this moment, not just the physical confrontation, but the emotional and spiritual challenge it represented. This wasn't just about boxing, it was about proving to himself that a man could rise above the limitations others placed on him. The bell rang, and Morrison came out exactly as everyone expected, aggressive, confident, looking to end things quickly. His first combination was picture-perfect, a jab followed by a devastating right hook that would have dropped most fighters where they stood. But Rocky had done something unexpected. He had studied Morrison's film just as carefully as Morrison had studied his. Instead of engaging in the kind of wild brawl that had characterized his earlier career, Rocky moved with calculated patience, slipping punches and absorbing others on his gloves and arms rather than his head. The second round began with Morrison's frustration becoming visible for the first time. The fight wasn't unfolding according to the script everyone had written. Where he expected to find a broken opponent nursing wounds and considering surrender, he instead faced a man who seemed to grow more determined with each passing minute. Rocky's defensive strategy wasn't just about survival. It was about learning, adapting, finding the rhythm and timing that would allow him to turn the tide. Morrison's corner was already making adjustments, his trainer barking instructions about varying his attack patterns and not letting Rocky settle into a comfortable rhythm. But the Hammer was used to overwhelming opponents quickly, and the prolonged engagement was forcing him into unfamiliar territory. His punches, while still powerful and precise, carried a hint of desperation that hadn't been there in the opening round. Rocky, meanwhile, was beginning to implement the strategy he and Mickey had developed during their late-night training sessions. Instead of trying to match Morrison's speed and power, he would use his opponent's aggression against him, making him work harder than he was accustomed to, forcing him to expend energy on punches that either missed entirely or landed on Rocky's guard, rather than their intended targets. The crowd began to sense that something was different about this fight. The easy knockout they had expected was turning into something more complex, more interesting. Rocky's stubborn refusal to fall down was transforming what should have been an execution into an actual competition. Conversations in the VIP section shifted from discussing when Morrison would finish the job to analyzing why Rocky was still standing. By the 4th round, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. Morrison's perfect technique was becoming slightly sloppy as fatigue began to set in. He had never been required to work this hard for this long, and his conditioning, while excellent, wasn't designed for the kind of sustained effort Rocky was demanding. The Hammer's breathing was becoming labored, and sweat was now streaming down his face in ways that had nothing to do with the arena's heat. Rocky, conversely, seemed to be hitting his stride. The early rounds had allowed him to download Morrison's patterns and timing, and now he was beginning to counter-punch with increasing effectiveness. His jab, never spectacular, was finding its mark with growing frequency, and his body shots were beginning to take their toll on Morrison's perfect physique. Each thudding impact to the hammer's ribs was an investment in future rounds, weakening the foundation of power that Morrison's entire style depended upon. The betting odds in the crowd were beginning to shift. What had started as 50-1 against Rocky was now closer to 20-1, still heavily favored toward Morrison, but acknowledging that this wasn't going to be the simple destruction everyone had anticipated. High rollers who had bet large sums on an early Morrison knockout were beginning to sweat almost as much as the fighters themselves. Morrison's corner was becoming increasingly animated between rounds, their earlier confidence replaced by urgent tactical discussions. They could see what everyone else was beginning to notice. Their fighter was being drawn into the kind of war he wasn't prepared for. The hammer's style depended on quick, devastating victories, not the grinding, attritional warfare that Rocky was imposing. But it was in the 7th round that the real transformation began to occur. Morrison, desperate to reassert his dominance, began to abandon the technical precision that had carried him to his perfect record. His punches became wider, more telegraphed, as he sought the knockout blow that would restore order to his universe. This was exactly what Rocky had been waiting for, the moment when his opponent's frustration would overcome his discipline. Rocky began to press forward for the first time in the fight, not with the wild abandon that had characterized his earlier career, but with calculated aggression. His combinations were simple but effective, designed to maximize damage while minimizing his own exposure. Each exchange was building toward something, though exactly what remained unclear to everyone except Rocky himself. The crowd was now fully engaged, their earlier dismissal replaced by growing excitement. They were witnessing something they hadn't expected, a genuine fight between two warriors, each bringing something different to the canvas. Morrison's superior skill and conditioning were being challenged by Rocky's heart and tactical intelligence, creating a dynamic that was far more compelling than the one-sided beatdown they had paid to see. Morrison's face was beginning to show the wear of sustained combat. His left eye was starting to swell, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. The body shots Rocky had been investing in earlier rounds were paying dividends, slowing the hammer's movement and reducing the snap in his punches. For the first time in his professional career, Morrison was being forced to dig deep, to find resources within himself that he had never needed to access. Rocky, meanwhile, was entering the zone that all great fighters know, the place where pain becomes irrelevant, where strategy gives way to instinct, where the body operates on pure will. His face was marked and swollen, evidence of the punishment he had absorbed, but his eyes remained clear and focused. He was no longer just surviving, he was beginning to believe he could win. The 8th round opened with both fighters showing the effects of their war. Morrison's perfect composure was completely gone now, replaced by the desperate aggression of a man who could feel his invincibility slipping away. His cornerman had spent the break between rounds trying to restore his confidence, reminding him of his superior skills and urging him to stick to his game plan. But game plans become irrelevant when facing an opponent who refuses to cooperate with your expectations. Rocky emerged from his corner with something new in his demeanor. Not just determination, but a kind of serene confidence that hadn't been there before. The early rounds had been about survival and learning. The middle rounds had been about implementation and adjustment. Now, as the fight entered its final phase, Rocky was ready to make his statement. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Where earlier Rocky had been content to slip and counter, now he was pressing the action, forcing Morrison to fight the kind of close-quarters battle that favored the older fighter's experience and heart over the younger man's athleticism. Rocky's jab was now landing almost at will, snapping Morrison's head back and disrupting his timing. Morrison tried to establish distance, to return to the long-range boxing that had served him so well in his previous fights, but Rocky wasn't allowing it. The Italian stallion had learned to cut off the ring, to use angles and positioning to limit Morrison's movement options. Every time the hammer tried to circle away, Rocky was there, applying pressure and forcing exchanges. The crowd was now completely absorbed in the drama unfolding before them. The VIP section, which had spent the early rounds networking and making side bets, was now focused entirely on the ring. Even the most casual boxing fans could see that they were witnessing something special, not just a fight, but a story of transformation and redemption playing out in real time. Morrison's punches, while still dangerous, had lost their earlier crispness. The sustained pace was taking its toll on his conditioning, and his perfect technique was beginning to break down under pressure. His footwork, once fluid and precise, was becoming flat-footed and predictable. The body shots Rocky had been accumulating were making it harder for Morrison to maintain his mobility. But it was Rocky's mental game that was proving most devastating. Throughout his career, Morrison had been accustomed to opponents who wilted under pressure, who became discouraged when their best efforts failed to stop his advance. Rocky was different. Each punch he absorbed seemed to fuel his determination, rather than diminish it. His ability to take punishment and keep coming forward was demoralizing Morrison in ways the hammer had never experienced. The ninth round began with Morrison making one last desperate attempt to reassert control. He came out swinging with renewed aggression, throwing combinations with the kind of bad intentions that had finished so many previous opponents. But Rocky was ready. Instead of backing down, he met Morrison's aggression with his own, standing toe-to-toe and trading punches in the kind of exchange that defines great fights. The crowd exploded as both fighters unloaded everything they had. Morrison's right hand found its target, staggering Rocky and sending him stumbling backward toward the ropes. For a moment, it seemed like the hammer had found the knockout punch everyone expected. Morrison pressed forward, sensing victory, throwing follow-up combinations designed to finish the job. But Rocky did something that surprised everyone, including Morrison. Instead of covering up or trying to escape, he fired back immediately, his own right hand finding Morrison's jaw with a sound that could be heard over the crowd's roar. The hammer stopped in his tracks, his eyes suddenly unfocused, his perfect balance compromised for the first time in the fight. What followed was the kind of sequence that becomes boxing legend. Rocky, sensing his opponent's vulnerability, pressed forward with a combination of punches that was neither pretty nor technical, but devastatingly effective. His left hook to Morrison's body doubled, the hammer over, and his follow-up uppercut snapped Morrison's head back with sickening force. Morrison tried to clinch, to buy time and clear his head, but Rocky wouldn't allow it. He pushed Morrison away and immediately resumed his attack, his punches now carrying the accumulated weight of every doubt he had faced, every time someone had counted him out, every moment he had questioned whether he belonged in the same ring as his supposedly superior opponent. The referee was watching closely now, ready to step in if Morrison couldn't defend himself. The hammer was still throwing punches, but they were arm punches, desperate swings that carried no real threat. His legs were unsteady, and his eyes had the glassy look that experienced referees recognize as the precursor to serious trouble. Rocky stepped back for just a moment, not out of mercy, but to measure his opponent for what he sensed could be the finishing blow. The arena fell into a strange quiet, the kind of hushed anticipation that occurs when everyone realizes they're about to witness something extraordinary. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 2 seconds. In that brief pause, Morrison tried to gather himself, to summon the superior skills and conditioning that had carried him through 37 previous victories. His corner was screaming instructions, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. The perfect fighter who had entered the ring was gone, replaced by a man discovering what it felt like to be truly hurt for the first time in his professional career. Rocky saw everything he needed to see in Morrison's eyes: the confusion, the fear, the gradual recognition that his world was about to change forever. This was the moment Mickey had prepared him for during those late-night training sessions, when the old trainer had told him that every fighter, no matter how talented or confident, has a breaking point. The key was recognizing when you had found it. The Italian stallion stepped forward with deliberate purpose, his movements now carrying the confidence of a man who had found his moment. His left hook was perfectly timed, catching Morrison flush on the jaw just as the hammer tried to mount one final offensive. The sound of leather against flesh echoed through the arena like a gunshot, followed immediately by the much softer thud of Morrison's body hitting the canvas. The crowd erupted in a mixture of shock and celebration. Those who had bet against Rocky were stunned into silence, while the few believers who had seen something special in the underdog were on their feet, screaming themselves hoarse. The referee immediately began his count, but it was clear to everyone in the arena that Morrison wouldn't be getting up. The hammer lay motionless on his back, his perfect body finally betrayed by the limitations of his perfect record. Rocky stood over his fallen opponent for just a moment, not in triumph or arrogance, but in the kind of quiet acknowledgement that passes between warriors who have pushed each other beyond their limits. There was no showboating, no premature celebration, just a man who had discovered something about himself that he had always hoped was there, but had never been completely sure of. The count reached 10, and the referee waved his arms to signal the end of the fight. Rocky Balboa, the washed-up club fighter who nobody had given a chance, had knocked out the undefeated Tommy Morrison in the 9th round of what was supposed to be a routine victory for the Hammer. The impossible had happened, and every person in the arena knew they had witnessed something that would be talked about for decades. Rocky's corner exploded into celebration, Mickey Goldmill leading the charge despite his advanced age. The old trainer had seen something in Rocky that others had missed, and his vindication was complete. The cutmen, the sparring partners, even the arena workers who had watched Rocky's preparation, all of them were sharing in a moment that transcended sport and entered the realm of pure human drama. Morrison's corner was a study in contrasts, shocked silence mixed with frantic concern for their fighter's condition. The invincible champion was slowly regaining consciousness, but his eyes held a new understanding of his own mortality. His perfect record was gone, along with the aura of invincibility that had carried him to the brink of superstardom. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything the arena had ever witnessed. The initial shock gave way to a sustained ovation for Rocky, as if the audience was collectively apologizing for having written him off before the fight even began. Even those who had lost money betting against him seemed caught up in the moment, recognizing that they had witnessed something special. Rocky made his way to Morrison's corner, where the Hammer was now sitting up, but still clearly dazed. The gesture was simple but profound. Rocky extended his glove to his fallen opponent, not in condescension, but in genuine respect for a warrior who had pushed him to find his best self. Morrison, despite his confusion and disappointment, accepted the gesture, the two fighters sharing a moment of mutual acknowledgement. The post-fight interviews would capture only a fraction of what had actually occurred in the ring. Rocky's words were simple and humble, reflecting the character that had carried him through the longest 9 rounds of his life. He thanked his team, his supporters, and even Morrison for giving him the opportunity to prove what he was capable of achieving. Morrison's response was equally gracious, though tinged with the bewilderment of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered in the space of 27 minutes. He acknowledged Rocky's heart and determination, admitting that he had underestimated his opponent's will to win. The defeat would ultimately make him a better fighter and a better man, though that understanding would come later. The betting windows were chaos as the impossible payouts were calculated. Those few believers who had backed Rocky at 50-1 odds were about to become very wealthy, while the high rollers, who had bet heavily on Morrison, were learning an expensive lesson about the unpredictability of human will. The arena slowly began to empty, but the energy of what had occurred seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Rocky sat in his locker room, his face swollen and marked by the battle he had endured, but his eyes clear and bright with the satisfaction of a man who had answered the most important question of his life. He had wondered, during all those years of small fights and smaller purses, whether he had what it took to compete at the highest level. Now he knew. Mickey Goldmill sat beside his fighter, both men understanding that they had shared something that transcended the typical trainer-fighter relationship. The old man had seen potential in Rocky that others had missed, and his faith had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. Their preparation had been perfect, not just the physical conditioning and technical work, but the mental and emotional preparation that had allowed Rocky to maintain his composure when everything was on the line. The medical examiner cleared both fighters, though Morrison would need several days to fully recover from the effects of the knockout. His camp was already planning their next moves, understanding that while this defeat was devastating, it didn't necessarily end the Hammer's career. How he responded to this setback would define the next chapter of his boxing journey. Rocky's phone was already ringing with offers. Promoters who had ignored him for years were suddenly eager to discuss future opportunities. The victory over Morrison had transformed him overnight from a journeyman fighter into a legitimate contender, opening doors that had seemed permanently closed. But Rocky's response to the sudden attention was characteristically humble. He wanted to go home to Philadelphia and process what had happened before making any major decisions. The sports media was scrambling to rewrite their stories, transforming what had been planned as coverage of Morrison's inevitable victory into analysis of one of the most stunning upsets in recent boxing history. The narrative was irresistible. The aging underdog, who had refused to accept limitations imposed by others, who had found a way to overcome seemingly impossible odds through sheer determination and smart preparation. The wider boxing community was already debating the implications of Rocky's victory. Some argued that Morrison had been overrated all along, that his perfect record had been built against inferior competition. Others recognized the achievement for what it truly was, a veteran fighter reaching into reserves of skill and will that even he hadn't been certain existed. Rocky's journey back to Philadelphia was surreal, marked by recognition from strangers who had watched the fight and been moved by what they had witnessed. The victory represented something larger than boxing. It was a story about refusing to accept other people's definitions of your limitations, about finding strength in the face of overwhelming odds. The neighborhood where Rocky had grown up buzzed with excitement and pride. Local bars and restaurants stayed open late, celebrating their hometown hero's triumph. Children who had never shown interest in boxing were suddenly throwing punches at imaginary opponents, inspired by the example of someone who had proven that heart could overcome talent when paired with intelligent preparation. But perhaps the most significant transformation was occurring within Rocky himself. The victory had answered questions about his abilities, but it had also raised new ones about his future. At 31, he had finally achieved the breakthrough that had eluded him for so many years. The question now was what he would do with the opportunities that success had created. Mickey understood that this moment was crucial for his fighter's development. Victory could be as dangerous as defeat if it led to complacency or poor decision-making. The old trainer was already planning Rocky's next training camp, understanding that greater challenges would come with increased expectations and attention. Morrison, meanwhile, was facing his own period of reflection and adjustment. The defeat had been his first taste of failure at the professional level, and how he processed that experience would determine whether it became a stepping stone toward greater achievement or the beginning of a decline. His natural talent remained intact, but his understanding of what was required to compete at the highest level had been fundamentally altered. The fight's aftermath would continue to reverberate through the boxing world for months to come. It had reminded everyone that the sport's beauty lay not in predictable outcomes, but in the possibility that on any given night, a fighter could transcend expectations and achieve something that seemed impossible. Rocky's story was particularly resonant because it spoke to universal human experiences, the feeling of being underestimated, the challenge of maintaining belief in yourself when others have given up on you, the satisfaction of proving doubters wrong through preparation and perseverance rather than luck or circumstance. 3 weeks after the fight, Rocky found himself in a position he had never experienced, being pursued rather than pursuing opportunities. Promoters who wouldn't return his calls 6 months earlier were now competing for his attention, offering fights against top contenders and promising purses that dwarfed anything he had earned in his previous career combined. But the victory had changed Rocky in ways that went beyond his market value as a fighter. The confidence he had gained wasn't the brash arrogance that often accompanies sudden success. Instead, it was a quiet self-assurance rooted in the knowledge that he had tested himself against elite competition and emerged victorious. He approached decisions about his future with the same methodical patience he had shown in the ring against Morrison. Mickey played a crucial role in helping Rocky navigate his new reality. The old trainer had seen promising fighters destroyed by success as often as by failure, and he was determined that Rocky would avoid the pitfalls that had claimed other late-blooming champions. Their conversations about future opponents focused as much on timing and preparation as on potential earnings or publicity benefits. The boxing media's coverage of Rocky had undergone a complete transformation. Writers who had dismissed him as Tommy Morrison's next victim were now crafting features about his inspiring journey from obscurity to contention. The narrative was compelling. A working-class fighter from Philadelphia who had refused to quit on his dreams despite years of setbacks and disappointments. Morrison's response to defeat had been equally impressive. Rather than making excuses or demanding immediate rematches, he had taken time to analyze what had gone wrong and how he could improve. His team had identified weaknesses in his conditioning and ring intelligence that the loss to Rocky had exposed, and they were working systematically to address those deficiencies. The relationship between the two fighters had evolved into something approaching mutual respect. They would never be friends, but they shared the bond that exists between warriors who have pushed each other to their limits. Morrison privately admitted that Rocky's victory had been earned, not lucky, and that admission marked an important step in his own development as both a fighter and a person. Rocky's training for his next fight reflected the lessons learned from the Morrison victory. Instead of dramatic changes to his style or approach, he and Mickey focused on refining the strategies that had proven effective. Rocky's ability to absorb punishment while maintaining offensive pressure became the foundation for a more sophisticated tactical approach. The gym where Rocky trained became a pilgrimage site for young fighters, hoping to absorb some of his success through proximity. But Rocky's approach to these aspiring boxers revealed another aspect of his character. He was generous with advice and encouragement, understanding how important it was for established fighters to support those coming up behind them. Media obligations that had once seemed impossibly out of reach were now routine parts of Rocky's schedule. Television interviews, magazine photo shoots, and promotional appearances required time and energy that had previously been devoted entirely to training. Learning to balance these demands with his preparation became another skill Rocky had to master. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. Rocky's purse for beating Morrison had exceeded his earnings from his previous 10 fights combined, and the offers coming in promised even greater rewards. But both he and Mickey understood that financial security could become a trap if it reduced his motivation or hunger for continued improvement. Philadelphia embraced Rocky as a symbol of the city's blue-collar resilience and determination. Local politicians wanted to be photographed with him, businesses sought endorsement deals, and children throughout the area began wearing Italian stallion t-shirts to school. The attention was flattering, but also overwhelming for someone who had grown up in relative anonymity. Rocky's family life required significant adjustments as well. The privacy he had once taken for granted was now a luxury, and simple activities like grocery shopping or going to restaurants became complicated by recognition and requests for autographs. Learning to maintain some semblance of normal life while managing his new public profile became an ongoing challenge. The most important change, however, was internal. Rocky had always believed he had the potential to compete at the highest level, but belief and certainty are different things. The victory over Morrison had transformed hope into knowledge, possibility into reality. This psychological shift affected every aspect of his approach to boxing and life. Training camps that had once been about proving he belonged were now about maintaining the standards he had established. The pressure was different, but no less intense. Instead of fighting to gain recognition, he was now fighting to justify the recognition he had earned and to continue building on the foundation the Morrison victory had provided. 6 months later, Rocky faced his next major test against Carlos El Toro Rodriguez, a seasoned Mexican fighter whose aggressive style and granite chin had earned him a reputation as one of the division's most dangerous opponents. The contrast with the Morrison fight was immediately apparent. Where Tommy had been a technically skilled but mentally untested fighter, Rodriguez brought 15 years of professional experience and a warrior's mentality forged in the crucibles of Mexico City and Las Vegas. The preparation for Rodriguez required different strategies than those that had proven effective against Morrison. El Toro's style was predicated on constant pressure and body punishment, the kind of grinding warfare that had broken fighters with superior athletic gifts but lesser determination. Mickey and Rocky spent months developing tactics specifically designed to neutralize Rodriguez's strengths while exploiting the subtle weaknesses that only revealed themselves through careful study. Rocky's approach to this training camp reflected his evolution as a fighter and as a person. Where preparation for Morrison had been driven by desperation and the fear of wasting his last opportunity, training for Rodriguez was characterized by professional confidence and systematic improvement. Rocky was no longer fighting to prove he belonged. He was fighting to establish himself as a legitimate force in the division. The media build-up for the Rodriguez fight was markedly different from the Morrison promotion. Rocky was no longer the unknown quantity facing impossible odds. He was now a proven commodity, whose victory over an undefeated prospect had earned him genuine respect within boxing circles. Rodriguez, for his part, welcomed the opportunity to face a fighter whose recent success had elevated his profile and market value. El Toro's public statements about Rocky were respectful, but pointed. He acknowledged the Italian stallion's heart and determination, while suggesting that those qualities alone wouldn't be sufficient against a fighter of his experience and tactical sophistication. Rodriguez had studied film of the Morrison fight extensively and believed he understood the blueprint for defeating Rocky's pressure-based style. The fight itself unfolded as a chess match between two fighters who understood each other's capabilities and limitations. Rodriguez employed the kind of veteran tricks that only come with years of professional experience. Subtle holding, strategic clinching, and body positioning designed to disrupt Rocky's rhythm without drawing the referee's attention. But Rocky had evolved as well. His ring intelligence, always present but sometimes overwhelmed by emotion, was now his primary weapon. Instead of walking into Rodriguez's traps, he created his own, using feints and subtle shifts in tempo to keep El Toro guessing about when and how he would launch his attacks. The middle rounds of the fight showcased both men's championship-level conditioning and tactical acumen. Rodriguez's body shots were taking their toll, but Rocky's counterpunching was gradually wearing down the Mexican fighter's aggressive style. Each round was close enough that different judges might score it for either fighter, creating tension that kept the crowd engaged throughout. It was in the 9th round that Rocky demonstrated the most significant development in his fighting style. Instead of relying on the sustained pressure that had broken Morrison, he showed patience and timing that surprised everyone, including Rodriguez. Rocky picked his spots carefully, investing in combinations that built toward a specific tactical goal rather than simply overwhelming his opponent with volume. The knockout, when it came, was different from the Morrison finish. Instead of a single devastating blow, it was the culmination of a systematic breakdown that had been building throughout the fight. Rocky's left hook to Rodriguez's body in the 10th round was the final piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for 30 minutes, and El Toro's inability to continue was the result of accumulated damage rather than a single moment of vulnerability. Rodriguez's reaction to defeat was characteristic of a true professional. He acknowledged Rocky's superiority on that night, while maintaining confidence in his own abilities and future prospects. The respect between the fighters was genuine and mutual, reflecting their shared understanding of what it meant to compete at the highest level of their sport. The victory over Rodriguez established Rocky as more than just the fighter who had upset Tommy Morrison. He had now defeated two different types of opponents using different tactical approaches, demonstrating the versatility and ring intelligence that separate contenders from champions. Boxing analysts began discussing him as a legitimate threat to win a world title. Rocky's post-fight interview reflected his continued growth as both a fighter and a public figure. His comments were thoughtful and respectful, acknowledging Rodriguez's contributions to the fight while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to continue testing himself against elite competition. The humility that had characterized him before his breakthrough remained intact despite his growing success. The victory over Rodriguez opened doors that had been unimaginable just 18 months earlier. World Championship opportunities that had seemed like impossible dreams were now realistic possibilities. And Rocky found himself mentioned alongside established champions and top contenders in discussions about the division's future direction. But success at this level brought pressures and expectations that dwarfed anything Rocky had previously experienced. Media attention that had once been flattering novelty was now constant scrutiny. Every training session, every public appearance, every comment was analyzed for insights into his state of mind and preparation. The privacy that had allowed him to develop his skills in relative obscurity was now a luxury he could rarely afford. Mickey's role became increasingly important as Rocky navigated these new challenges. The old trainer served not just as a tactical advisor, but as a buffer between his fighter and the various forces seeking to influence or exploit his success. Mickey's experience with previous champions helped him understand which opportunities were worth pursuing and which were potential distractions. Rocky's next opponent was announced as Victor the Siberian Express Petrov, a Russian heavyweight whose amateur pedigree and professional record had established him as one of the division's most feared punchers. Petrov brought a different set of challenges than either Morrison or Rodriguez. Superior size and reach, combined with the kind of systematic training methodology that had produced generations of successful Eastern European fighters. The preparation for Petrov required Rocky to reach new levels of physical and mental conditioning. The Russian's style was built around establishing distance and using his significant height and reach advantages to pick apart opponents before they could get close enough to implement their own strategies. Rocky and Mickey spent months developing approaches that would allow the Italian stallion to overcome these inherent disadvantages. Training camp became an obsessive pursuit of marginal improvements in every aspect of Rocky's game. His footwork, always functional but not spectacular, was refined to allow him to cut off the ring more effectively against a taller, rangier opponent. His defensive technique was adjusted to deal with angles and trajectories that were different from those he had faced against shorter fighters. But the most important preparation was mental. Petrov had broken fighters who were technically superior but mentally unprepared for his systematic approach to destroying opponents' confidence. The Russian style was designed not just to win rounds, but to convince fighters that they had no path to victory, gradually eroding their will to continue competing. Rocky's mental preparation involved visualizing not just success, but also the moments of doubt and difficulty that Petrov's style was designed to create. Mickey understood that this fight would test Rocky's psychological resilience as much as his physical skills, and their training sessions included scenarios specifically designed to simulate the frustration and discouragement that Petrov typically imposed on his opponents. The build-up to the Petrov fight generated the kind of international attention that transforms boxing matches into cultural events. Russian media portrayed the fight as a test of their training methodologies against American determination, while American coverage focused on Rocky's continuing evolution from underdog to legitimate championship contender. Petrov's public statements revealed a fighter who had studied Rocky's previous victories and believed he understood how to neutralize the Italian stallion's strengths. The Russian expressed respect for Rocky's heart and determination, while maintaining confidence that superior technique and physical advantages would prove decisive over the course of 12 rounds. The weight of expectations was different for this fight than it had been for either the Morrison or Rodriguez bouts. Rocky was no longer fighting to prove he belonged. He was fighting to establish himself as the division's next championship-level threat. The pressure was internal as much as external. Rocky's own standards had evolved along with his success. Fight night arrived with an atmosphere of anticipation that reflected Rocky's transformation from unknown quantity to main event attraction. The crowd included not just hardcore boxing fans, but celebrities and casual observers drawn by the narrative of his continuing rise through the heavyweight ranks. Petrov entered the ring with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously tested by American competition. His amateur background had given him technical skills that surpassed most professionals, and his size and reach advantages were immediately apparent when the fighters were introduced. The Russians' team had developed a specific game plan for defeating Rocky's pressure-based style. But Rocky's entrance revealed the confidence of a fighter who had found his identity and understood his capabilities. The uncertainty that had characterized his earlier appearances was replaced by the quiet assurance of someone who had tested himself against elite competition and consistently found ways to win. The early rounds unfolded exactly as Petrov's corner had planned. The Russian used his jab effectively to keep Rocky at distance, landing clean shots while avoiding the kind of exchanges that had allowed the Italian stallion to overcome his previous opponents. Petrov's amateur technique was evident in his ability to score points while minimizing his own risk. Rocky's corner remained calm during the early going, understanding that their fighter's style required patience and opportunity creation rather than immediate dominance. Mickey's instructions between rounds focused on small adjustments and tactical patience rather than dramatic strategic changes. By the 6th round, Rocky had begun to solve some of Petrov's puzzles. The Russian's technique, while excellent, was somewhat predictable in its systematic approach. Rocky began timing Petrov's jab and finding opportunities to counterpunch effectively, gradually turning the fight into the kind of closer-range battle that favored his style. Petrov's corner recognized the shift and began urging their fighter to maintain distance and stick to the game plan that had been working effectively. But Rocky's pressure was different from what they had prepared for. Instead of wild, rushing attacks, he was cutting off the ring intelligently and creating opportunities through positioning rather than pure aggression. The turning point came in the 8th round, when Rocky's bodywork, which had been accumulating throughout the fight, began to affect Petrov's mobility. The Russian's movement, so fluid and effective in the early rounds, became slightly labored as the sustained pace and Rocky's targeting of his midsection took their toll. Rocky sensed the opportunity and began to press his advantage systematically. Instead of rushing for a knockout, he maintained the pressure that was working while looking for the opening that would allow him to end the fight decisively. His patience and tactical maturity were evident in his willingness to build toward victory rather than seeking it immediately. The 9th round began with Petrov showing visible signs of fatigue for the first time in the fight. His jab, while still technically sound, had lost some of its snap and frequency. The body shots Rocky had been investing in throughout the middle rounds were paying dividends, slowing the Russian's movement and reducing his ability to maintain optimal distance. Rocky's corner could sense the shift in momentum and urged their fighter to maintain pressure without becoming reckless. Mickey's instructions were simple but crucial. Continue working the body, stay patient with the openings, and trust that the accumulated damage would create the opportunity for a decisive finish. Petrov's team was becoming increasingly animated between rounds, recognizing that their fighters' physical advantages were being neutralized by Rocky's tactical intelligence and conditioning. The systematic approach that had served Petrov so well throughout his career was being countered by an opponent who had evolved beyond their pre-fight expectations. The crowd could feel the tension building as both fighters understood they were approaching the fight's decisive moments. Rocky's supporters, who had learned to appreciate his patient tactical approach, sensed that their fighter was positioning himself for another dramatic finish. Petrov's backers urged their fighter to rediscover the distance and technique that had controlled the early rounds. Rocky began the 10th round with increased urgency, but maintained the discipline that had carried him through his recent victories. His combinations were more frequent and aggressive, but they remained targeted and intelligent rather than wild or desperate. Each punch was thrown with specific tactical intent rather than hope for an immediate knockout. Petrov tried to establish a clinch to buy time and disrupt Rocky's rhythm, but the Italian stallion had learned to work effectively in close quarters. Instead of allowing Petrov to rest during the clinches, Rocky continued to target the body and maintain psychological pressure even during the breaks in action. The decisive sequence began with Rocky's left hook to Petrov's liver, a punch that was perfectly timed and placed. The Russian's reaction was immediate and telling. He doubled over slightly, and his guard dropped for just a moment. Rocky recognized the opportunity and followed up with a right uppercut that snapped Petrov's head back and left him vulnerable. What followed was a combination of punches that showcased Rocky's evolution as a finisher. Instead of overwhelming Petrov with volume, he picked his shots carefully, each punch building on the damage created by the previous one. His technique had improved dramatically from his early career, but it was his tactical intelligence that made the combination so devastating. Petrov tried to cover up and survive the round, but Rocky's pressure was relentless and intelligent. The Italian stallion varied his attack between head and body, preventing the Russian from establishing any kind of defensive rhythm. Each punch was thrown with bad intentions, but also with the precision that comes from years of studying opponents and understanding their weaknesses. The knockout punch was a left hook that caught Petrov flush on the temple as the Russian tried to duck under what he expected to be a right hand. The deception was perfect. Rocky's setup had convinced Petrov to defend against one attack while leaving himself vulnerable to another. The punch landed with the kind of precision that separates elite fighters from mere contenders. Petrov collapsed immediately, his legs betraying him as consciousness fled. The referee began his count, but it was clear to everyone in the arena that the Russian would not be getting up. Rocky had scored his most impressive knockout yet, not through raw power, but through the kind of tactical brilliance that characterizes championship-level fighters. The crowd erupted in appreciation for what they had witnessed, not just another knockout, but a demonstration of tactical evolution and fighting intelligence. Rocky had defeated 3 different types of opponents using 3 different approaches, proving that his early success had been no fluke. Rocky's celebration was characteristically understated. He checked on Petrov's condition before allowing his corner to embrace him, showing the kind of sportsmanship that had become his trademark. The victory was significant, not just for its immediate impact, but for what it suggested about Rocky's potential at the highest levels of the sport. The post-fight interviews captured Rocky at his most articulate and confident. His comments reflected not just satisfaction with the victory, but understanding of what it meant for his career trajectory. He was no longer just winning fights, he was making statements about his readiness for championship-level competition. Petrov's gracious acceptance of defeat further enhanced both fighters' reputations. The Russian acknowledged Rocky's superior performance while maintaining his own dignity and professional pride. The respect between the fighters was evident and genuine, reflecting their shared commitment to excellence at the highest level of their sport. Boxing analysts began discussing Rocky not just as a contender but as a potential champion. His 3 consecutive victories over elite opponents had demonstrated versatility, intelligence, and the kind of steady improvement that suggests greatness rather than merely talent. 1 year after the Morrison fight that had changed everything, Rocky Balboa found himself in a position that would have seemed impossible during those long years of obscurity and modest purses. World Championship opportunities were no longer distant dreams, but immediate possibilities, and his name was mentioned alongside the division's established elite as a legitimate threat to capture a title. The transformation had been as much mental and emotional as physical and tactical. Rocky had learned to carry the expectations and pressures that came with success, while maintaining the hunger and humility that had driven his rise. The confidence he had gained was the quiet assurance of someone who had tested himself repeatedly against elite competition and consistently found ways to prevail. Mickey's role in Rocky's development had been crucial throughout this period of rapid ascension. The old trainer's experience and wisdom had helped Rocky navigate not just the tactical challenges of facing increasingly sophisticated opponents, but also the psychological and emotional demands of life as a top contender. The gym where Rocky trained had become a laboratory for the kind of scientific approach to boxing that characterized modern championship-level preparation. Every aspect of his game was analyzed, refined, and optimized based on the lessons learned from each successive victory. Technology that had once been available only to established champions was now part of Rocky's regular preparation routine. But perhaps the most significant change was in Rocky's understanding of himself and his capabilities. The question marks that had defined his early career about his chin, his conditioning, his ability to compete with elite talent, had been systematically answered through competition rather than speculation. He knew what he could do because he had done it repeatedly under the brightest lights against the best available opposition. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 18 months after the Morrison victory. Rocky's promoter delivered the news that every fighter dreams of hearing. He had been offered a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship. The champion, a skilled but aging veteran named Marcus "the King" Williams, was looking for a high-profile opponent who could generate significant pay-per-view interest. Rocky's reaction to the championship opportunity reflected his evolution as both a fighter and a person. Instead of the desperate gratitude that might have characterized his response to such news earlier in his career, he approached the opportunity with the measured confidence of someone who had earned his position through systematic excellence. The preparation for Williams would require everything Rocky had learned about high-level training and tactical preparation. The champion was a complete fighter whose reign had been built on intelligence, experience, and the kind of veteran savvy that could only be acquired through years of championship-level competition. But Rocky approached the challenge with resources he had never possessed before. Not just physical conditioning and technical skill, but the psychological confidence that comes from knowing you have overcome every challenge presented to you. The underdog who had shocked Morrison was gone, replaced by a legitimate championship contender who belonged in the conversation about the division's best fighters. The story that had begun with impossible odds and desperate hope had evolved into something much larger, a demonstration of what was possible when talent, determination, and intelligent preparation were combined with the kind of opportunities that success creates. Rocky's journey from dismissed journeyman to championship contender had taken less than 2 years, but it represented the culmination of a lifetime of development and dedication. Mickey understood that this moment represented not just the achievement of a goal, but the validation of a philosophy about what was possible in boxing and in life. The methods they had used to develop Rocky's skills and maximize his potential had proven effective against increasingly sophisticated opposition. Training camp for Williams would begin immediately, but Rocky faced it with the confidence of someone who had solved every puzzle presented to him. The championship fight would be his greatest challenge yet, but it would also be the opportunity to complete a transformation that had begun with a single question. What would happen when everyone bet against him, but he refused to accept their judgment? The answer had been written in the ring over the course of multiple victories against elite opposition. Rocky Balboa had become exactly what he had always believed he could be, a championship-level fighter whose success was built on intelligence, preparation, and an unshakable belief in the power of human will to overcome seemingly impossible odds. The crowd that had bet against him in that first fight with Morrison would have a very different fighter to evaluate when he stepped into the ring for his championship opportunity. The underdog was gone, replaced by a proven commodity whose 3 consecutive victories over elite opponents had earned him the right to call himself a contender in every sense of the word. Rocky's journey from forgotten fighter to championship contender proves that our greatest victories often come not from avoiding the odds, but from embracing them. Sometimes the biggest risk is believing in yourself when nobody else will. His story reminds us that champions aren't born in moments of triumph. They're forged in the quiet hours when everyone else has gone home, in the decision to try one more time when every rational voice says to quit. What dreams are you still fighting for? What odds have you been told are impossible to overcome? Drop A if Rocky's story inspired you to keep pushing, and hit that subscribe button because every champion needs a corner rooting for them. Sometimes the fight that changes everything is the one everyone expects you to lose.